Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Kester. I am a cattleman from Parkfield, California. I serve as president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I am pleased to welcome you to NCBA's End of the Year Policy Update webinar featuring our team in Washington, D.C. We look forward to hearing from experts on several priority areas for NCBA, including the Farm Bill, environmental issues, fake meat, trade, and more. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen, and at the end of the presentation, the team will answer as many questions as time will allow. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at beefusa.org. That's beefusa.org. As I mentioned, we have several members of the NCBA team in DC joining us tonight to discuss many of the wins NCBA has achieved for producers in 2018. We will start the update with our Chief Lobbyist, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, Colin Woodall. Colin, it's all yours.
Thanks, Kevin, and appreciate everybody joining us here this evening. As Kevin said, it has been an interesting 2018. And given the makeup of the current Congress and the effort by the Trump administration to focus on regulatory rollback, we, as your NCBA team in Washington, D.C., have had a great opportunity to achieve many successes. It's always important to remind all of you as members the important part that you play in our success in Washington, D.C. We are a grassroots organization, and your engagement in your state affiliate and also through the NCBA committee process allows you to bring ideas, debate ideas, vote on policy positions that we as your staff then take to Washington and implement and try to get as many victories as possible. And that is the process that we utilize to set up our policy priorities for this year. And as a result, we are able to talk tonight about several significant wins that ultimately help keep the government out of your business and allow you to do what you do every day, and that is make the best tasting beef in the world. So to get started, I want to turn it over to Allison Rivera, who's our Executive Director of Government Affairs. Allison.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it. So as Colin stated, we have the whole DC team, the whole Government Affairs team here ready to give an update on quite a few issues tonight. So please bear with us as we get through a lot of information, and at the end, we'd love to be able to take questions. Assuming everyone can already see the first slide, the first thing, oh, sorry, little technical difficulties. Okay, so first up is just a snapshot of our 2018 policy priorities to remind people of some of the things we're going to talk about today, some of the wins that we're going to talk about. And just to give people an idea of some of the priorities that we had that we've been working on all year. Farm Bill, trade, fake meat, as Colin said, pushing regulatory reform, which includes quite a few items in there, and then antimicrobial use, which also includes reauthorization of a DUFA. So those are some of the issues that we're going to address today. So we're going to start off talking about the 2018 Farm Bill win. Some of the things that were in this bill that we were pleased to get and pleased to celebrate was the animal disease preparedness program, specifically the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank that NCBA was working hard on. Not only were we able to authorize this vaccine bank, but we were also able to get mandatory funding. The biggest item to pull from this slide is that while we do have money, a lot of this money will be up to the Secretary's discretion on how it's spent. All three of these programs work together, work hand in hand, and so we are grateful to have all three of them, but obviously we did push very hard for the vaccine bank. We are grateful for the mandatory funding, and we will continue to work with USDA and specifically the Secretary and APHIS to make sure that the funding for the bank is there. We will also look to other sources of funding through APROP's authorization. So that's certainly somewhere where we can get more discretionary funds. So we are grateful for the creation and mandatory funding of that bank. We also focused on the conservation title. We were happy to see an increase in funding of EQIP to the tune of over $2 billion. We did, however, lose the 60-40 livestock carve-out to 50-50, but we feel like there's still going to be plenty of opportunity for our producers to grab hold of some of those programs, and now there's a little bit more money to do so. In return for that money, there was money taken out of CSP, and so that money ended up going into EQIP, which is something that NCBA was supportive of through the process. Also on CRP, we knew there was going to be an increase, so it went from 24 million to 27 million. The kicker is that there is some flexibility for haying and grazing, which is also something that we had been working hard on. Our ASAP had a funding increase of 300 million a year, and then one of the items that I think will be important to a lot of you on the line is the feral swine eradication control pilot, which received $75 million to try to manage our feral swine issues. Some of the Farm Bill miscellaneous items that I wanted to point out, I know there are always a lot of complaints and concerns about the National Drought Monitor, and so the Secretary is going to work on collecting more data and trying to figure out the best way to manage that program moving forward. Again, trade was certainly a priority and will continue to be a priority, so we were happy to see level funding for the foreign market development and market access programs. There were some minor changes in LIP to cover death or sale loss as a result of diseases. Also, this bill changed some language to provide assistance for coverage under LIP for the death of unweaned livestock due to adverse weather. And then some changes to the livestock forage program as well, providing for feed cost replacement. So there were some miscellaneous items that were very positive in this bill. So as far as next steps, again, we know that Congress passed the bill. The President plans on signing this bill at a ceremony on Thursday. We will be in attendance, and so we were happy to be invited over for this. There were a lot of priorities included, but there were certainly some items that we would have really liked to have seen in this bill, particularly the forestry title, where we did not get the things that we really had worked hard for. Forest management was left out, wildfire mitigation, a WOTUS repeal, and then there are a lot of you on this call that were very concerned about more depredation permits for the black vulture. These are all items that we will continue as a team to be working on. Another win this year was the reauthorization of ADUFA. ADUFA stands for Animal Drug User Fee Act. ADUFA and AGDUFA, which stands for Animal Generic Drug User Fee Act. This was a reauthorization that happens every 5 years, and we needed to get done. So we were grateful to hold meetings on the Hill and to get that across the finish line. The reason that this is important is it allows FDA to maintain predictable and timely new animal drug review process. We want to make sure that if there are drugs that need to get out onto the market quickly so that you all can be using those, we want to make sure that they don't get caught up in the bureaucratic process. And so we were grateful to get that win. It was on our priority list for 2018, and we got it across the finish line. Here are just some new provisions in the ADUFA for reauthorization, limited expansion of conditional approval, meaning that drugs can get through a little bit faster and that we can take a look over that time period at the efficacy of those drugs. And once those 5 years are up, they can either choose to move forward with those or take a step back. So we were grateful for some of these provisions in the reauthorization. So let's talk very quickly ELD and hours of service. So this is somewhat new information. FMCSA did recently deny our application for an ELD exemption, if you will. And so we did get that notice. They have been denying a lot of applications recently, and so ours was right up there with it. As most of you know on this call, we sit in an exemption right now, not due to the agency, but due to congressional work. We are still waiting on the appropriations language. We do have ELD delay language in both the House and Senate bills. I don't think it's lost on anybody that's listening in today that we are sitting in a place where we need to fund the government past the 21st. And so we could have a continuing resolution, and in that case, we would keep our ELD delay, but we are still keeping close watch and trying to figure out what the next steps are there. We do have a petition to FMCSA on hours of service. While ELDs are certainly a concern, we are keeping a close eye on hours of service. That's really the bigger issue at hand. This petition was filed back in October. It does request 15 hours of drive time, 16 on duty with a 10-hour rest. We feel like it's a very strong petition that includes some fatigue management training that our haulers would participate in. That's kind of what we're putting on the table in order to get those 15 hours of drive time. Essentially, the way the petition works is if FMCSA grants it, they would give us 5 years to drive those 15 hours, and they would take record of the safety data. And if at the end of the 5 years it was working well, then they could move forward with making that permanent. And then what are the next steps on transportation? We will continue to fight for the ELD delay. We don't like to just continue to kick the can down the road, but we will do that as long as we need to. We will be looking for supportive comments from members of Congress, from our state affiliates, and from anyone who wants to submit comments of support on the hours of service petition. We will continue to work with this new Congress to add 150 air mile exemption on the back end of hauls. We currently have it on the front end, and we would love to continue to work to get it on the back end. And then also, just as another plug, we are continuing to work with the coalition and work on increasing truck weights. It's certainly not an easy issue, but something that's still that we are still working on in the transportation world. Now I'm going to kick it over to Ethan Lane, our Senior Executive Director of the Public Lands Council and NCBA Federal Lands.
Thank you, Allison. As Colin and Allison have already mentioned, we've had a busy year here in Washington. In the federal lands world, we've spent a lot of our year focusing on our regulatory agenda. I'll cover a few of our top priorities tonight, kind of where we are in some of those processes and what we expect to see over the coming months. I want to preface some of this. Obviously, the news this week has focused on the departure of Secretary Zinke from the Department of the Interior. I want to be clear that while we are going to miss his leadership in that department, we do not anticipate much of a hiccup in our regulatory work at the Department of Interior due to that departure. That's because of that strong team in place that includes Deputy Secretary David Bernhardt and others that will continue to move forward on these priorities. We are also expecting an announcement of a new secretary in the next day or two from the White House, so we'll be looking out for that as well. The three top items we've been focusing on in the federal lands world in that regulatory space are the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and Grazing Regulations through the BLM and Forest Service. Clearly, for anybody operating on federal lands in the West, those are sort of the big three items that can really make or break your sustainability and success in an operation in the Western United States. First on that list is ESA. This has been a top priority for NCBA for quite some time. We took a two-pronged approach to this issue. Regulatory work, obviously working with the White House and the Department of Interior, as well as a legislative push on Capitol Hill through the Western Governors Association's ESA initiative over the past several years. That initiative resulted in what we thought, along with others, to be very effective legislation produced through the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Unfortunately, as some things do happen in the Senate, sometimes that legislation did not progress quickly enough to get a vote in this Congress. We have continued to push on that. We are disappointed that we didn't see more activity on this front out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, particularly as it is chaired by a Western Republican, Senator Barrasso, who's been a champion on these issues for us in the past. We've been in contact with their committee, as well as some of the stakeholders across the aisle. We are expecting those conversations to continue into the new year, but I want to be clear that with the change in House leadership from Republicans to Democrats, the path gets very different moving into the next year. Democrats have been clear that this is not an issue they're eager to take up, and we expect this to be a much rockier path. Because of that, our focus is really going to be on a lot of those regulatory wins where we are making quite a bit of progress on that front. To talk a little bit about that, I'm going to turn the time over for a few minutes here to Tanner Beamer, our Manager of Government Affairs for ESA and NEPA, to walk you through some of those key provisions in this first round of rulemaking.
Thanks, Ethan. So as was said, we are continuing to advocate for congressional changes to the Endangered Species Act, but that has not stopped the Trump administration from taking the first step on the regulatory front to bring some much needed relief in the ESA space. In July, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service issued three joint rulemakings, proposed rulemakings that were aimed at curbing some of this stuff. First has to do with Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act, which deals with listing and critical habitat. One of the biggest things here is that it removes a regulatory condition that listing decisions be made, quote, without reference to possible economic or other impacts, end quote. That is based upon a requirement in the underlying act that listing decisions be made solely on the basis of the best scientific and commercial data available. And while striking the prohibition on the reference to economic impacts will not influence a listing decision, it is very useful information, especially for state and local governments who are trying to determine what the economic impacts of implementing those recovery goals are. In addition, the Section 4 of Rulemakings ensures that listed entities would be delisted if they're found not to meet the statutory definition of a species. The most notable example of this is, for those of you in the Southwest, the Mexican gray wolf. Emerging science continues to question whether or not that species is in fact a unique species in and of itself or just a subspecies of the gray wolf. And if it is eventually determined that they do not meet the taxonomic definition of a species, that they would then be delisted without having to go through the delisting process. Additionally, it firms up the agency's interpretation of the foreseeable future. That applies mostly to species listed as threatened. And currently, there's no clear definition in the Act or the implementing regulations as to what the foreseeable future means. This rulemaking proposes to define in regulation that the foreseeable future extends only so far into the future as the services can reasonably determine that a threat exists, instead of just arbitrarily picking a date in the future where they can guess. And those determinations will be made on a case-by-case basis for each species. And then this is probably one of the more significant pieces. It does require that the occupied habitat be prioritized for designation as critical habitat. The services do retain the authority to designate unoccupied habitat, but they would be directed to prioritize habitat that is occupied. That comes into play, especially when we're talking about a Supreme Court case called Weyerhaeuser versus the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in which Fish and Wildlife designated a habitat privately held by the Weyerhaeuser company that is known to be home to the dusky gopher frog. This is in Louisiana. Those frogs do not currently inhabit the land which was designated, and the question brought before the court was, did Fish and Wildlife overstep their bounds in that case? That was heard before the Supreme Court before Justice Kavanaugh was seated, which would have most likely resulted in a 4-4 split, which means that it would have upheld the lower court's ruling, which was in favor of Fish and Wildlife. So the Supreme Court unanimously voted 8-0 to vacate the case and remand the question about critical habitat back to the Fifth Circuit. That does allow for attorneys to appeal that back to the Supreme Court with all 9 justices on the bench. Moving on to rulemaking also proposes to remove the blanket 4D rule that treats threatened species with endangered protections, even though they are only listed as threatened. That is not retroactive, but going forward, species would not automatically receive those protections. And then finally, on Section 7 with interagency consultation, Section 7 of the ESA requires that the federal agencies consult with other agencies to discuss what recovery efforts would impact those ongoing projects. And so what it would do is it's just generally streamline Section 7 by clarifying various definitions of terms like the environmental baseline, programmatic consultation, and effects of action. And it revises the definition of destruction or adverse modification to include as a whole. That way you're not looking at unique areas of a habitat, you're considering it in terms of the entirety of the habitat for that species. So these are great rulemakings. They make a lot of progress for us. NCBA and PLC submitted formal comments on these. And we expect additional rulemakings to come in 2019 on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Section 6, which deals with state consultations, and Section 10, which deals with take permits. And with that, I'm going to pitch it back over to Ethan.
Thank you, Tanner. The other area that we've put a lot of focus on in the last year is revisions to the National Environmental Policy Act. We spent considerable time with the White House and the Department of Interior to focus on that NEPA revision. Earlier this year, they issued a notice of preliminary rulemaking. We commented extensively on that rulemaking. The focus of our comments was on enhanced use of categorical exclusions, as well as an effort to more clearly define and enhance the role of impacted parties, enhance the state's role in the NEPA process, clarify that the amount and type of information required by NEPA in an evaluation is only that which is essential for a reasoned choice, and revise guidance regarding the use of reasonable alternatives in the establishment of baselines as well as the definition of a no-action alternative. We are expecting to see a final rule in the coming months out of the White House, and we feel like this really is going to be a substantial step forward as we move to make NEPA work better for producers on the ground. One final area I want to cover quickly is grazing regulations. We view this as the third leg of the stool in working to improve conditions for Western ranchers. Grazing regulations have not been substantially updated since Range Reform 94. Anybody who's been working on these issues for a while will remember the cry of the environmental community in the early 90s was cattle free by 93. That was Bruce Babbitt and his gang during the Clinton administration. The rewrites they made to the grazing regulations substantially altered the landscape. We've been dealing with the fallout ever since. PLC, NCBA, and the American Sheep Industry Association have put substantial time and effort along with our state affiliates into a comprehensive set of revisions and suggestions to revisit that Range Reform 94 program and get those regs back to a place where they work better for producers. We are working with the Department of Interior and others now to look for opportunities to deploy those suggestions. We're told this is something that's in the agenda for the coming year, and we're looking forward to making substantial progress on this. So across the board, there have been a lot of wins in the federal lands world this year, and we'll be looking forward for more opportunities here in the coming year. I'll turn it back over to Allison now for our next speaker.
Absolutely. So advancing the slide, we're going to hear about fake meat from Danielle Beck, our Senior Director of Government Affairs.
Good evening. Before I get into the politics of this, I think it's important to first start by saying that NCBA has been driving the conversation and the policy debate on fake meat since day one, starting with the passage of policy at our annual convention last year. And I would even say that before that, we were the first ones having conversations about this issue in Washington, D.C. And it's critically important that we get the regulatory framework governing these products right, because ultimately that's going to have long-term market ramifications for real beef producers. And so it's important to understand our enemy. What do we know about cell-cultured meats? The first burger that was unveiled in the EU cost $300,000 in 2013. That cost of production is now down to $11, and this technology is continuously evolving. Cells that were once collected through muscle biopsy can now be taken through cells collected from the tip of a chicken feather. The primary growth medium was once fetal bovine serum. Now it's plant and algae based. The purveyors of these products can create chicken breasts, and chicken nuggets will probably be the first product out onto the market. Just last week, there was a Wall Street Journal video that featured our president, Kevin Kester, in which they featured a quote-unquote lab-grown steak product. It was a shaved-looking steak. It was thin, not a real muscle cut. Bovine and porcine cells are a little bit more difficult to work with. The first products will ultimately be burgers or meatballs, but eventually down the road, muscle cuts are not that hard to imagine. The regulatory framework, while it sort of remains unclear, has, we've made significant progress on over the last year. Ultimately, what has informed our process and our strategy on this issue is the law. The laws governing USDA versus FDA. The Federal Meat Inspection Act has several parameters that are really, really important in terms of maintaining an even playing field. And that's, when it comes to safety, daily continuous inspection, making sure that there's equivalency for any foreign product that comes into this, the U.S. market, and a mandatory labeling pre-approval system, which ensures that FSIS approves all product labels before they can legally enter the U.S. market. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, on the other hand, dictates that inspections are risk-based, meaning that a plant may not have an FDA inspector on site once every 3 years or once every 5 years. Their labels are not pre-approved, meaning that it's incumbent upon FDA to take enforcement action once a product has already entered the market. And as we've seen with dairy products, there are very clear parameters around soy milk and almond milk. They're nutritionally inferior, therefore legally they're required to be labeled as imitation. And the word imitation should precede the product name in the same size lettering and font. But legally these products are misbranded, and FDA has turned a blind eye to the law for a couple decades now. A couple months ago, FDA acknowledged something that we all know to be true, and that's that almonds don't lactate. But the first time National Milk reached out to FDA to take enforcement action on this issue was in February of 2000. We know that if FDA is allowed to move forward in a primary jurisdictional role, we will be forever at a disadvantage, because the agency has no qualms about picking winners or losers And at this point in time, they have a long-standing track record of picking winners in the plant-based and vegan fields. So we've decided that USDA needs to be the primary regulator for a number of reasons. You know, at the end of the day, it's the only agency that will allow for an even playing field, because we're not afraid of the competition, but the only way that we can truly compete is if that playing field is fair. You know, at the end of the day, there are several regulatory definitions under the Federal Meat Inspection Act that have informed our thinking. Each one of these decisions comes with its own set of handling requirements and standards, food safety requirements, and labeling. The definition of a meat byproduct is any part capable of use as human food other than meat which has been derived from one or more cattle, sheep, swine, or goats. Whether or not these products, you know, scientifically fit under a meat food product, you know, remains to be seen. They need to be vetted under a microscope, but they absolutely, you know, legally qualify as meat byproducts. And so, you know, our justification for USDA jurisdiction is absolutely within the law. It's, you know, within the bounds of what we're angling towards. And meat byproducts have their own set of labeling requirements. So just to keep that in mind as we advocate for USDA jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that we're advocating that these products are meat. Although I will say the purveyors of some of these products have been quoted as saying, our beef is beef, our chicken is chicken. You know, until we get them under a microscope, that remains to be seen, but that's what's informed our process. In terms of the timeline, what's happened since we passed policy, in April, Secretary Perdue went on record as saying that he believed that USDA should have primary jurisdiction of these products, and since then we have been fighting tooth and nail to ensure that that actually happens. There was a provision in the FY19 House Agriculture Appropriations Bill that clarified USDA jurisdiction. That language did not sit well with the folks and the activists at FDA. And so in June, shortly thereafter, they announced that they were the preeminent regulators and would be holding their first public meeting on the topic. Their press release, in that press release, Commissioner Gottlieb references the importance of this technology to consumers who are motivated by animal welfare concerns and the economic incentives of switching over to this production technology, including the environmental benefits. It is highly unusual for a commissioner of FDA to be commenting on societal concerns such as sustainability and animal welfare. If you close your eyes, it sounds like a commissioner appointed in the last administration, not this one, but that's what we're working with. In July, we sent a letter to OMB. We sent a letter to the Trump administration. Because of our efforts in applying pressure to the administration, this October, USDA and FDA held a joint public meeting on the topic. We put out a call to action. We actively participated in FDA's public meeting. Kevin Kester and Jennifer Houston were active and vocal proponents at the joint public meeting. You know, we were one of the biggest proponents in facilitating that meeting. But as a result, recently in November, USDA announced that there would be a dual framework governing these products, and they extended the comment period to December 26th. We are still encouraging all of our affiliates and members to engage and submit comments because this is very much a work in progress. But at the end of the day, this is the policy that we passed at last year's convention, and this is what we are going to be fighting for. We firmly believe that the definition of beef should only apply to real products produced the way that God intended, not products grown in a lab. And so we are going to continue fighting tooth and nail to ensure that the appropriate descriptors and nomenclature are applied to these products, and that there are the necessary safety mechanisms and measures in place to ensure that these products are safe before consumers eat them. So we're going to be fighting day in and day out. There's still a lot of work left to do, but that's what we're working on, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you, Danielle. Next up is Kent Backus, our Senior Director of International Trade, for a solid trade update. Kent.
Good evening, everyone. I think there's no surprise that trade has been one of the probably one of the most controversial issues for the last year. We have a president administration that believes in using aggressive tactics, and so we are starting to see some of that unfold. Obviously, I think some of the bigger things we've looked at were the use of tariffs to create leverage, and we have seen some of the benefits of that with the conclusion of the NAFTA renegotiation, which is now called the USMCA, and the renegotiation of the Korea What we're waiting to see is what's going to happen next with Japan, since we're out of the TPP, and whether or not we can see a trade agreement really move forward there, and also just to see how the rest of the battle with the tariffs is going to unfold. But I think overall, this has been a very good year for us on the export side. Our sales have increased significantly, up nearly 20% since last year. We're on pace to exceed $8 billion for this year. And for right now, that means that we're averaging about $320 to $340 per head solely due to exports. Japan, South Korea are our number one and number two markets. Korea has really been a tremendous market this year, with our sales up almost 50%. So we are going to continue to watch what's happening in the Asian market, but even here in North America, we continue to see strong sales in both Mexico and Canada. The big news, obviously, with USMCA, we were pretty pleased with this. There were no major changes for the beef and cattle trade sectors. We maintained duty-free access, unrestricted access to Canada and Mexico, and we were able to avoid the inclusion of failed policies in the past, like mandatory country of origin labeling. So we are excited to see that the continued success we've seen under NAFTA will continue. This agreement was signed by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico on November the 30th. We're hopeful that Congress will be able to ratify this in the next year or so, but this will still be subject to the fast-track process, so that means that no action will actually occur until the White House sends this to the Hill. It's possible that we could see some kind of bipartisan effort with the House Democrats, Senate Republicans, and President Trump working together, but I think we also need to be aware of the realities, and that's the fact that Nancy Pelosi's already stated that she doesn't like the agreement, wants to make changes to it. And so I think that it's unlikely that Congress is going to ratify that agreement anytime soon. At the same time, the president could also pull the trigger and start a 6-month countdown by threatening to actually withdraw from NAFTA. Obviously, that would be a very dangerous thing for us economically, so we're hopeful that won't be the case. But I think it's still too early to tell how this is going to play out, but there's a lot of things moving. And then when you look at our big success story in Korea, as I mentioned, our sales are up significantly this year. We're already reaching the $1.5 billion mark. Prior to our agreement there, we faced a 40% tariff. We're seeing that going all the way down to zero here in just a matter of years. We have surpassed Australia in that market. We still have a lot of room to grow there as well. So we're really happy with this. This is a great example of how trade agreements work. But our big focus, the market that we'll continue to focus on in the next year, is going to be Japan. This is our biggest export market by far. We have really come on strong, especially with the drought in Australia. But we've made a lot of gains in that market. Unfortunately, we still face a 38.5% tariff. And our main competitors, the Australians, and to a lesser extent, Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand, are all going to have significantly better tariff rates than us starting December 30th. Their tariff rates will drop to around 27% and then drop again on April the 1st. That puts us at a significant disadvantage. And so we're going to continue to push the administration to prioritize a trade agreement with Japan. I think that we cannot take for granted the terms that were negotiated under TPP. We're going to have to fight for those. And so our concern is that we've made a lot of gains with this drought in Australia. We could jeopardize that. We could lose that if we don't see significant action soon. And then China. China represents the biggest population for now. Population of 1.4 billion people, and obviously this is we're in the middle of a prolonged battle with the Chinese, not only on trade but on a lot of other fronts. We're going to see the continuation of tariffs on Chinese goods. Beef will continue to be a retaliatory target. So right now we're facing roughly a 50% tariff when you add everything together. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Keep in mind, we're part of a much bigger battle right now, and so we're hopeful to see some, advancements. Hopeful to see some kind of long-term trade agreements come out of these ongoing talks. But I think we really need to buckle down and be ready for a rough ride. And speaking of rough rides, we've had a really bad one with the European Union for the last 30 years or so. This is by far our hardest market. We face some of the strongest restrictions, not only the hormone ban, but also restrictions on beta agonists, potentially antibiotics, and a lot of other things. We also face a very limited access on the tariff and the quota front as well. We've tried to really make some advancements, tried to improve this relationship, but it continues to drag on. So we're hopeful that with this new effort to try to strike a bilateral trade deal, we'll see some movement there. But we're dealing with some very entrenched views, and this is going to be very tough. And while we're in Europe, we'll swing over to the United Kingdom. There's been a lot of talk about a potential bilateral agreement with the UK on the possibility that they will leave Europe without any firm trade deals in place, without any free trade terms. And so what we do know is that at 11 o'clock on March 29th, the UK is going to leave. What we don't know is what that relationship is going to be like with Europe. If they make a clean break, we could see some opportunities there to swoop in and try to really address a lot of the systemic problems we've had with the EU and eliminate those non-tariff barriers. But I think we also have to just wait and see how this is going to play out. What we could see the formal talks begin with the UK as soon as they leave. But there's still going to be a couple of years before they'll leave completely. So I think we need to expect some of the same protectionist battles we've had with the EU. But I think this is a market that we cannot underestimate, and we still see a lot of opportunity there. So stay tuned.
Great. Thank you, Kent. Appreciate that update on trade. Next, we have our Chief Environmental Counsel, Scott Yeager, to talk about EPA issues. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Allison. I'm going to start with WOTUS. It's been a centerpiece of our EPA portfolio here for the past number of years. We've been fighting this issue. Let me back up to that slide for 1 second and tell you about these pictures. So left side, you've got something that is clearly a traditional navigable water. It's a canal. It's got a container ship on it. Clearly that falls under federal jurisdiction as a WOTUS. The image on the right is of a kind of a gully on a row crop field that was determined by the Army Corps of Engineers to constitute a waters United States. So that's the issue we're fighting here, guys. We don't want the federal government asserting federal jurisdiction over ditches and gullies near cattle operations. So I've been fighting this for a while now. Let's show you how we've kind of been attacking this through litigation in the courts, through lobbying the federal agencies, and as well as working on the Hill to get Congress to pass legislation. So in the courts, this is our litigation coalition, so you can see all the groups that we're sharing the courtroom with here. So it's a lot of ag groups, Farm Bureau, pork producers. You also have home builders, stone, sand, gravel, energy. You've got the road builders, forest and paper, and many others that are all rallied behind us to get this issue fixed. Here's what we're fighting in the courts. On the other side of the V, you've got all these environmental groups who are suing the agencies, saying that the 2015 WOTUS rule didn't go far enough. Okay, so you can take a look at those and kind of get a feel for who we're battling with here, but these are the usual suspects. Oftentimes they're trying to force more regulation on agriculture through litigation against the government. So nothing too surprising here, but wanted to put the names up on the screen. So in addition to industry and environmental groups litigating this, you have a number of states that are in the courts fighting the government on this issue. It's probably one of the first times that we're seeing state attorneys general banding together to litigate this issue in many different courts. So all the red states are the states that are suing the government in opposition of the 2015 rule, much like we are positioned. The blue states are litigating it in support of it, basically saying it didn't go far enough. So Interestingly, you'll see that these are falling down partisan lines. The red states are also Republican-led state governments. The blue states are also democratically led governments. But I wanted to put that up there for everyone to be aware that this is a huge issue with states as well. So not to get into too much detail here, but we've been fighting this in the court since 2015. Most recently, action has taken place in Georgia in the federal district court there, as well as the federal district court in Texas. And last week, we actually had oral arguments in our Texas case on the substance of the 2015 rule, meaning we're actually at the point now where we're having the issues, our arguments on why the 2015 rule is illegal being decided by a judge. So we might have a decision in that Texas or Georgia case in early 2019. And just to play that out a little bit, looking into the future, if we can get a good decision on the 2015 rule and have a court say that it's illegal and overturn it, that sets us up really well administratively to get this thing replaced by the administration without having to go through the process of formally repealing it. But also at the same time, when things are in the courts, things get squirrely pretty quick. And as we saw over the summer, the U.S. District Court in South Carolina issued a vacatur of a delay rule, which was designed by the EPA to buy time to repeal and replace the 2015 rule. By vacating that delay rule, basically they slammed the 2015 rule back down into place into a number of different states across the country. So right now we're functioning under this patchwork. Yellow states on the screen are those that are subject to the 2015 WOTUS rule. The green states are the ones that are protected from it by virtue of other injunctions that were put in place by other courts. So it's a mess right now. So we're working to get that fixed. The good news is once the rule is formally repealed or vacated by a court, it's going to get rid of this patchwork and we'll have more definitive and certainty moving forward. So Congress tried to act on this issue recently in the House Appropriations bill as well as the Farm Bill. Both of those got scrapped. So those are not in play at this point, but Congress still takes an active interest in this issue to this day. We were on the Hill last week briefing House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee as well as Senate EPW staffers on the new proposal that just came out last week, which we'll be getting into in a minute here. But administratively, this is how this issue gets solved. It gets solved through the Trump administration repealing and replacing the 2015 rule through the Rulemaking Authority as the federal agencies of the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. So this is happening right now. Step one, which is a repeal of the 2015 rule, is in process. It's not yet completed yet. And then step two, the replacement portion, just got proposed last week. And our messaging on the replacement rule is that we want clean water and clear rules, and we think we can get both of those things through this new water proposal. So we want to protect our nation's waterways and drinking water, and we think there is a role for the federal government to have safeguards in place to protect waterways, and we think there's also a role for states to have their authority to be protected as well. And ranchers and farmers want to protect the environment. We want clean water. We need it, and we think this new proposal will get us there. So here is an image from the announcement last Tuesday. NCBA President Kevin Kester was on stage for the announcement. A number of officers were also present for the event. And the new water rule proposal is basically the new definition of WOTUS that's been proposed by the Trump administration. We think it strikes the right balance between safeguarding federal waters while also protecting private property rights. A big deal with this new rule is that it eliminates case-by-case determinations, meaning it gets rid of a lot of the latitude that the old rule had, which gave discretion to the agencies to interpret it however they want. And notably, there are named exemptions for stock ponds, farm ponds, prior converted cropland, and ditches. There's going to be a 60-day comment period when this hits the Federal Register. So the takeaway on this new water rule is it is a significant improvement over the 2015 WOTUS rule that we have fought very hard to get to where we are today. So we're very happy to be at this stage in the process. The process is not over yet. This is a proposal. It has to go through the administrative rulemaking process, and at the end of that process, they will finalize this rule. But in the meantime, we'll be developing and submitting comments on behalf of cattle producers, and we'll probably be criticizing some of the portions in there that need to be fixed. So it's not perfect, but to the extent that we can help make it better, we're going to be engaging on that. So just to put it all in perspective, there's multiple parts here moving all at once, And where we're at right now is that we have a new WOTUS definition, which is that last line at the bottom of this table that just got proposed in the last quarter of this year. And just to kind of lay it out here, the yellow lines are the administrative rulemaking process, the blue lines are litigation. So every piece of this process is being litigated by environmental groups. We're going to be in a little bit of a different litigation posture when we get sued, because environmental groups will be choosing their preferred courts to go to, and we're going to have to be reactionary in trying to defend it. But that's the process moving forward. And then ultimately, this is an issue that will go before the Supreme Court for the 4th time in 30 years. And hopefully with Kavanaugh and Gorsuch in place, we'll have a strong conservative wing that will respond favorably to this new proposal.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. Now we're going to kick it over to our other environmental counsel, Mary Thomas Hart, to talk a little CERCLA and EPCRA.
Thanks, Allison. So as you can all tell, it's been a pretty busy and productive year in the world of environmental regulation. And beyond WOTUS, Scott and I work on a lot of issues in the EPA world. And one example of this is emissions reporting under CERCLA and EPCRA. So in 1980 and 1986, Congress passed 2 laws related to the management and cleanup of hazardous substances. And this was to prevent events like the Love Canal and the Bhopal, India explosion, and those laws are called CERCLA and EPCRA. Part of those laws is a reporting requirement for air emissions into the environment, and for livestock agriculture, those emissions could consist of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Now, we know that odor emissions aren't dangerous, and so does EPA. In 2008, EPA crafted an exemption for all livestock operations from CERCLA reporting and only required large CAFOs to report emissions under EPCRA. Now, CERCLA reports go to the federal government and EPCRA reports go to state and local emergency responders. So under this exemption, only large CAFOs were really required to report to their local emergency responders. We were really happy with this, but enviros didn't like it very much. I think that we've found over the years that enviros really don't have much common sense and don't like common sense rules. So they sued us, and in 2017, the DC Circuit Court found that EPA's exemption was illegal. So when that exemption was vacated, all agricultural operations with over 200 head of cattle were subject to reporting requirements under both CERCLA and EPCRA. So that's reporting to the federal, state, and local governments. That really put us to work. So we, to attack the issue, we tried to divide the 2 laws. So as you can see, CERCLA, when addressing CERCLA, we followed one path of action, and in attacking EPCRA, we're currently working with the administrative agencies. So our biggest fish to fry, I think, was ensuring that producers don't have to report to the federal government. So CERCLA was our main focus. And in March 2018, Congress passed the Farm Act into law, and President Trump signed it. So now farmers and ranchers across the country are not required to report manure emissions to the federal government under CERCLA. Now, this was a process that took about a year from the time the DC Circuit Court's opinion was released to the time we got the Farm Act passed into law, and it's not an easy process. We had to really work with our friends, our fellow agricultural associations. We kind of developed a strong coalition of like-minded groups, and I think one of the keys to getting this bill across the finish line was participation from members like you. So I think it's really important to say thank you to all of our members who made a phone call, who wrote a letter to their member of Congress to show that this issue was important out in the country. So now that producers are no longer required to submit reports under CERCLA, we've turned our attention to EPCRA. And currently, EPA is in the process of crafting a rulemaking to interpret the Farm Act so that producers are exempt under EPCRA as well. So that means that producers would not have to report to the federal government, and producers would not have to report to state and local governments. So under this proposal, all livestock operations would be exempt from EPCRA reporting requirements. NCBA submitted comments to this rulemaking last Friday, December 14th, and a lot of you, again, as well, submitted your own comments. So thank you so much for that, and there will be more to come in 2019 on our EPCRA progress, but it's been a very productive year in this world. Thank you.
Okay. As you all can see, there has been a tremendous amount of effort by our DC team here throughout 2018, and we've delivered several significant victories on many issues such as EPCRA and WOTUS. We've been able to make significant advancements. But as you also seen, there's a few things that we still have to work on, and that's going to be increasingly difficult for us given the changes coming to the new Congress. As everybody is aware, starting the first week of January, the 116th Congress will be sworn in, and it will be a split Congress. We will have a Democrat-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. Now, gridlock a lot of times for our major issues is a good thing. It allows us to stop bad ideas from happening. But in terms of trade, for example, we need to see the ratification of USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0, and hopefully some additional trade actions. We're still going to need Congress to take some votes that are useful for us and productive for us. And we're going to spend a lot of time trying to convince the new majority in the House that agriculture is important, even though they may not represent any farms or ranches. They have a lot of people that want to eat. So we will spend the first quarter of this new year working on building new friends, making new friends, and making sure we can be as effective as possible in this split Congress. Now, what will ultimately happen, we believe, is that the House will spend a lot of time on oversight hearings and trying to really drag the Trump administration through the mud. On the Senate side, they will play the role of spoiling any effort or legislation that comes out of the House, at the same time trying to prove and confirm as many Trump nominees as possible, not only nominees to the administration positions, but also nominees to the federal bench, which, as you can see, is also extremely important in our strategy, especially in the environmental arena. So while it's been a good year, still a lot of work to do. And again, our strength, our power comes from your engagement and your willingness to step up and help us craft the policy that allows us to work on all these issues. So with that, Josh, we will open it up for questions.
Well, Colin, this is Kevin. I've got a couple comments to make before we go to our Q&A. Number one, I want to thank all our staff in D.C. for their presentations. NCBA is committed to working on a strong future for the U.S. cattle industry. And I want to thank our D.C. staff for all their hard work. From my perspective as a rancher producer, in the past 10 years or so in leadership, as committee chairs and in the officer team, I can't talk enough about all the hard work and the good things that NCBA's DC staff does for all of us back in the country each and every day. So I can't say enough on the good work that they do. So as we move into our Q&A session, I want to take a moment to invite everyone to the upcoming Cattle Industry Convention being held January 30th to February 1st in New Orleans. Plan to come a day early and participate in the Cattlemen's College Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning. The entire convention provides great opportunity to hear in-depth information on current issues and challenges in the cattle industry and helps chart the course for our future. Take advantage of early bird discounts by registering before January 4th. Now let's get to your questions, and thanks again for participating in this webinar tonight. Josh, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Got a couple of questions in so far, and just want to remind everyone that's on the line, if you want to shoot a question in via the question box on your screen, we'll try to get to those right quick. The first question I have is related to EQIP. In the new farm bill, and just had a general question about the funding level, and also was there any change in how decisions are made on equip spending as far as having local or at least state control setting priorities priorities for how that EQIP money is spent?
I think, as I stated, we have over $2 billion for EQIP. I think as we work to implement this bill, it's one thing for Congress to send language over to USDA, but as we work with our friends over at NRCS, one of our goals will be to streamline that process as much as possible and to work with them to make sure that the agents have boots on the ground and that those programs can get through and okayed as fast as possible. I think a lot of that is kind of in the process, in the weeds kind of stuff that we will continue to work on, and we plan on making a priority as we move forward.
Thanks, Allison. I know that program's really popular all around the country. Another question came through about being able to legally shoot buzzards that are predatory on calves. The question reads, is there anything we can do about the time and price it takes to get a permit to legally take care of this predatory problem of black buzzards? So any updates on that front?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. There's substantial progress being made on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is the controlling statutes for regulation of black vultures and other birds of prey that a lot of our producers are experiencing problems with throughout the country. We've already seen the Department of Interior exercise some of their regulatory authority to ease restrictions on incidental take under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that's a direct result of the Solicitor's Office at Interior looking back into those regulations and trying to determine what their authority is to ease those restrictions a little bit. In those ESA rulemakings that Tanner discussed earlier, he mentioned that there was a round 2 coming. In addition to Section 6 and Section 10, we are expecting some additional movement on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This is an issue that we've continued to put in front of folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're keenly aware of the impact this has on our producers, and we've also continued to highlight the need to make sure we can get not only the permits out quickly, but enough volume to control the problem. If you have 100 birds on your operation, a depredation permit that allows you to take 3 is not going to get you where you need to be. So we're working with them to get those numbers right, and we've been pleased with the conversation so far. But as Colin said, we need to make some progress now while we have the opportunity. So we're hoping to see some of that movement here in the next year.
All right. This next one is for Scott Yeager. Question around the Supreme Court. What do you see happening with the Supreme Court ruling if WOTUS does come back before the Supreme Court with the current justices? And part 2, or sort of second part here, do you see the possibility of any additional judges being replaced during the Trump administration?
Yeah, great question. So there's 2 things about this rule. So there's the process requirements and there's substance, right? So the minefield is the process requirement. So under the Administrative Procedure Act, the government has to follow the rules on how you conduct a rulemaking. So if they can walk that minefield and get that through the courts, meaning showing the courts that they've spent enough time on notice and comments and basically showed that they had a reasonable interpretation of WOTUS and get the actual substance of what they believe is a WOTUS in front of the court, I think we're going to be in a really good spot. Getting there is going to be tough. I mean, the process issues are really easy ways for courts to throw out cases. But given that the Supreme Court has been really interested in this issue since the 1980s, and they're still not satisfied with how it's been interpreted by the agencies, especially under the past administration, I think they're chomping at the bit to get this case in front of them so they can decide it once and for all and actually provide some substantive guidance to the agencies on how far WOTUS can go. They tried to do that in 2006 with the Rapanos case, and they failed miserably and ended up with a 4-1-4 split decision. Justice Kennedy was that one swing vote that really created a quagmire that gave no guidance to the agencies. With him gone and Kavanaugh in place of him, we have a significantly different Supreme Court than we did in 2006 that I think will decide this rule. So the question is, can the agencies get this rule in front of the Supreme Court without falling into a mine? And that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that environmental groups are going to hit them on is NEPA analysis and ESA consultation. Those are two things that they did not do in this proposal. And they didn't do it because they felt like the government was not under any obligation to do so. So that's an open legal question as to whether or not they needed to conduct those analyses. And that's one that environmental groups are going to be hitting them on. So that's hopefully an answer to your first question. On the second one, as far as are there going to be any other justices that leave the Supreme Court, I would say yes. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in recent weeks fell and hurt her ribs, and she's 85 years old, and she's the oldest sitting member of the Supreme Court. She's been holding on for a while now, and I don't know if she's going to make it another 2 years before she has to retire. So if that happens, Trump's going to get a third Supreme Court pick in his first term. So that'd be a big deal, and that would really cement a very strong conservative majority in the Supreme Court beyond what's already there. So more to come on that, but a really good question. Appreciate it.
All right, well, that's all the questions that have been submitted. Allison, any parting comments? You or Colin or Kevin? The floor is yours. So,
Josh, thanks for everybody's time tonight. I think hopefully we gave everyone a good idea of all the things that we're working on. Colin, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, same thing. We just appreciate everybody joining in and look forward to your participation in our committee process when we get to New Orleans the end of January.
Hope to see everybody down in New Orleans. Good team.
Thanks, Kevin. Yep, and happy holidays to everyone. And I'll echo that. Hope to see you in New Orleans, and come see us at Cattlemen's College as well. Several of these guys that presented tonight will be on the docket also as part of Cattlemen's College, as well as committee meetings. So have a great holiday season, everyone, and we'll see you soon.